Assalamu alaikum and a good day. Welcome to History 204, History of the United States. We are meeting after some gap, a troublesome, trying, worrisome gap, and hope it gets over and Allah is kind to us to get this pandemic, coronavirus, and so that we can meet again in our classroom, in the old good classroom. I miss you all by seeing you, but I am here for you, and we wish to continue the semester as best as we can. But please be relaxed. There's nothing to be tense about it. This semester would be tailored, architected in your interests, and we can understand what kind of difficulties you people are experiencing, especially those who do not have an access to online facilities, internet or anything. I will be welcoming if any one of you let me know what the status of you is receiving the lectures online. So let's begin today talking about the one dark spot in American history, and that is the slavery, the human bondage. As if you remember what we discussed in our last lectures, that United States made progress by leap and bounds, and by the mid of 19th century, it got changed continually in hundreds of ways. It was changing a national economy marked by dependence of each area on the other, the production of goods in one region for sale in all. So basically, they were maturing as a system of governance. But the South was less affected by these changes than the other sections of urbanization, by European immigration, by the transportation revolution and industrialization. South did not receive all these facilities at par with the other northern states. The question was coming again, as US was an agrarian society and economy, that they improve the methods in their farming and their harvest started getting better and better, and the use of fertilizer, high nitrogen fertilizer of bird droppings, also increased their yields. Let's see, how was this slavery? What was this? Excuse me. In how many categories we can discuss? The first would be the economics of slavery. Slave population was getting improved by time, and river transport was being used to slave moving to the west. West was the new land for promise, and slaves were needed there. Slave trading got to a higher limits because more slaves were needed. It was not only confined to south or north. The west was opening up its arms for them. And this became a coercive measure for the slaves because they were separated from their families and they didn't like it. Who would like to be separated from their families? Because they thought that all of them could not move. They are needed also in their original places of work, so the families were divided. And by, as blacks, excuse me for saying it, but this is the term used, the ownership of slaves became more concentrated. Number of slaves then was getting lessened as they were becoming expensive to buy. So basically we have to see that the marketing, transporting, purchase of foreign goods, this was not allowed to the slaves. And even the percentages were low for them, and the middlemen supplied most of the foreign goods, and the planters purchased with their cotton earnings. So the economy of slavery was not the economy of the whites of the land. Southerners were very unhappy, and they could not do to correct it something, or they did little to correct it. Capital tied up in the ownership of labor could not be invested in anything else, and social pressure in the South militated against investment in trade and commerce. So it was a depressing sight. Under slavery, the reservoir of intelligence and skill that the blacks represented was almost entirely wasted. They were seen only as slaves and only for physical labor. The 18th century and up to Civil War, the master's house was basically the place for a slave to work, from home to fields, and they were not as comfortably compensated as they should. And slaveholding families were almost quite different from northern families of similar status because of their peculiar institution. The husband and wife were not working in separate spheres. Through their individual functions were different, though their individual functions were different and gender related. The planter families purchased all their life goods like clothing, furniture, china, as products such as sewing machines, books, and musical instruments. Plantations were basically busy centers of household manufacture, turning out most of the clothing of slaves, except for shoes and the everyday clothing of their own children, along with bedding and other textiles. So, the industry of spinning, weaving, and sewing were women's work, both for whites and blacks. So, when it comes to status of economic earning, women has to be seen as a number two. Nearly all the food consumed was raised on the land. Only tea and coffee and a few other food items were commonly purchased. So the life was not that challenged or complicated. The master was in charge of everything, and the master's wife also had immense responsibility. She was running the household. But also, it's not only household to run, but her role entailed being refined, graceful, and supposedly untroubled by worldly affairs. And most of slave-holding women had to learn of these things by doing in general. Unmarried young ladies had few responsibilities beyond caring for their own rooms and persons, and perhaps such ladylike tasks as arranging flowers. Are you reminded of Swiss grooming schools? The majority of the slaves of both sexes labored on the land from dawn to dusk. This is the way of farmers even today. Household servants and artisans might also be called on for such labor when needed. Slave women were expected to cook for their own families and do other chores after working in the fields. And children both free and slaves were cared for by slaves, the former by household servants, the latter usually by an elderly woman. And these slaves were happier than the general peasantry of England. Slavery was overall a humiliation imposed upon the whole mass of laboring population of the South. And that was the tragedy, even then. And let's talk about the sociology of slavery. It is difficult to generalize about the peculiar institution because so much depended on the individual's master. If the master were good, the relationship were not that paradoxical. And United States was the only nation in the Western Hemisphere where the slave population grew by natural increase. When the slave trade ended in 1808, the black population increased at nearly the same rate as the white. In 1860, there were about 4 million blacks in the country, and American slaves were not driven to extinction by any pretense or any thinking. And every white observer claimed that slaves were congenitally lazy. George Washington, for example, wrote, and I quote, "When an overlooker's back is turned, the most of them will slight their work or be idle together." But isn't this complaint even today between the labor and the people for whom they work for? Slaves were working as long and as hard as they could. The slaves rose in price, and northern opposition in the street grew more vocal. South liked the slaves, North was trying to bring them to a much more humane status of these bonded human beings. Slavery goes a long way in American history toward explaining why the South was so rural and why it had so little industry. Blacks were much harder to control in cities. In the United States, slavery and urban development proved to be incompatible. And let's talk about the psychological effects of slavery. The first thing is injustice. And if justice is not delivered, you have a corrosive effect on the personality of the slaves. And that was the fate of the slaves in southern America. Most slaves at least resigned to their fate because they could not see anything beyond that. Slave had strong family and group attachments and complex culture. They maintained, so to speak, under the noses of their masters. Slavery also warped the whites, whose stereotypical views of slave nature were nonetheless insistence for being contradictory. And the manufacturing in South discouraged business and commercial activity, but there were considerable manufacturing developed. Small flour and lumber mills, iron and coal were mined in Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. So we cannot say that they were totally ignorant of industry. Some kind of was there. But in comparison to the northern industrial juggernaut, and let me explain this word juggernaut here, it comes from the Hindi word Jagannath, the great master, the great holder of the money. The evolution is difficult to summarize, but we can see that American industry displayed a remarkable receptivity to technological change. Invention alone does not account for industrial advance. Every new natural resources were discovered and made available by the westward march of settlements. Industrial growth caused an increase in the demand of labor, and that is why when skilled artisans Technicians and tool makers earned good wages and found it relatively easy to find a job. Immigration increased also rapidly. People were coming to this new land for living a wonderful life, and it became a nation of immigrants. And immigrants from everywhere, all over the Europe and even from the East. The American society before Civil War reveals a paradox that is obvious but difficult to resolve. The progress and poverty went hand by hand, and there were reformers who were conducting investigations, and they published for labored to help the victim of urbanization and industrialization. The reign of the clipper ship was short, and the steamship was, especially the iron ship, became the fashionable thing. So the combination of competition, government subsidy, and technological advances drove down shipping things. And same was with canals and roads. When transportation became easier, so the railroads especially increased the economic power of America and economic capacity of United States of America. I'll see you in the next. Oh, I'll meet you. I keep on saying I'll see you because I miss you. So I'll meet you in the next lecture.